All right, and welcome back to Better Understanding the Bible. I'm your host, Dallas, and let's get to it. In this episode, we will be discussing the Torah, the covenant, and its two kingdoms. And just as a reminder, the purpose of this study is to honor audience relevancy, and that is to be able to take our eyes, if we could, out of our heads back into time and put them into the heads of Hebrew people who would have been living under the law, under the agreements of the covenants during the time that they were alive on the earth, and how they would have perceived things, how they would have walked in those things. So in that vein, again, honoring audience relevancy, let's do a quick refresh of what is the Torah. Well, the Torah is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Torah is also known as the 5 books of Moses. And that's because the Torah, which is also called the Law, are the books traditionally ascribed to Moses. So again, the Torah, the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The 5 books of Moses are considered to be the 5 books that were written down by Moses himself and are referred to as the Law of Moses, also called the Mosaic Law, which is the law which is said to have been revealed to Moses by God, the Torah. So just a quick reminder, I think most people in general are pretty familiar with that, and we're going to continue in that same vein of audience relevancy as the traditional view as seeing Moses as the author of the 5 books, which became the law over the people of Israel and how they lived and saw things. So now we're going to be moving into, to begin this discussion, Daniel 9:11. And that's because a lot of terms are being used in this one verse that are going to help us identify and go deeper into this conversation of the Torah and the story it tells about two covenant people. Now, when we read Daniel 9:11, we're going to see some of these terms pop out that we're familiar with and maybe some terms we're not. And what we're going to do is by taking a look at each individual statement and term, we're going to come to understand what the Torah is a bit better, how it was put together a bit better, so that as we get familiar with these terms, we will see how Moses structured the Torah a bit more clearly. So, without any more getting into this, let's go. So, Daniel 9:11. It says, Israel has transgressed your law, refusing to obey your voice, and the curse and the oath that are written in the law of Moses have been poured out upon us because we have sinned against him. Now, there's a lot of information being put into this statement. If we break it down slowly, we can clearly see what the message is. Israel has transgressed God's law. Well, what's your law? Well, that's obviously referring to the law of Moses in the Torah. In fact, we continue on and it says, refusing to obey your voice, the curse and the oath which are written in the law of Moses. So we know the context is being applied here, have been poured out upon us. We have sinned against him. So Israel's transgressed the law, and we can see it's refreshed in the last line because we have sinned against him. So Israel has sinned, transgressing the law of Moses. How? By refusing to obey his voice. So that's the main push, the main theme of what is going on is Israel has transgressed the law. They have sinned against the law by refusing to be obedient. Therefore, now as a result of that, the curse and the oath which are written in the law of Moses have been poured out upon Israel. So that should bring up a couple questions like what is the oath and what is the curse that was written in the law of Moses referring to? We understand that Israel has transgressed your laws referring to the law of Moses, so that's why they're considered to be sinning. They have sinned because they transgressed the law. But what is the curse? What is the oath? Well, when we go into the Torah, into the law of Moses itself, we read in Exodus the story of when Moses has just completed delivering Israel from Egypt, has brought them through the wilderness and brought them to the mountain of Sinai, and God has pulled Moses up the mountain and has said these words to him, saying, I want you to go and take these words to Israel. And so he says to Moses, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenants, then you shall be my treasured people, my treasured possession, rather, among all peoples. And you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So Moses called the elders of the people and set these words before them, as God commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So Moses brings Israel out of Egypt, delivers them to the mountain of God, goes up the mountain. God says, deliver these words to Israel. He comes down to Israel and says, God proposes that if you be obedient to his voice and keep his covenant, then he shall make you his treasured possession, and you will be the kingdom of priests and the holy nation. And Israel's response was, everything that he says, we will do. So that's the oath. They're actually swearing an oath and agreeing to the covenant with God. Verse 8 is the oath. All the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. They're swearing the oath. Now, when we read the conditions, verse 5, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, is exactly what we read in Daniel 9, which was the call for the transgression. So as we see, it says, Israel has transgressed your law. How? Refusing to obey your voice. The oath written in the law context. And here we have, if you will indeed obey my voice. So here's the oath. We can see it clearly being the reason why they transgressed, is they did not live up to their agreement. They did not live up to the oath they swore to. So Daniel 9 is saying Israel has transgressed the law of Moses, refusing to live up to the agreement they swore. Therefore, the curse that was written in that oath has been poured out upon us. Well, that brings up another question then, as if the oath is them swearing to the covenant, what is the curse referring to? Interestingly, we say, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. Well, we find out what the curse is associated to when we look at what the covenant is. For God's covenant treaty with Israel was set forth in a form common in the ancient Near East, a format known as the suzerain vassal treaty. In these treaties, the suzerain or superior promised the blessings for loyalty and obedience, and curses for rebellion. Meredith Kline, who was an American theologian and Old Testament scholar who also had degrees in Assyriology and Egyptology, gives us a brief summary of suzerain vassal treaties. As it states, in the ancient Near East, treaties between kings was common. These were treaties drawn up among equals and mostly outlined agreements to honor each other's boundaries, to maintain trade relations, and return runaway slaves. These treaties are preserved in the Mari tablets and in the Amran texts. Also preserved in these collections are treaties drafted between a superior and his inferior. If the relationship was familial or friendly, the parties are referred to as father and son. If the relationship is bereft of kindness and intimacy, the parties are referred to as lord and servant, or king and vassal, or greater king and lesser king. The greater king is the suzerain, the greater, and the lesser king is a prince, or a lesser lord in the service of the greater king. The lesser lord is a representative of the common people who are under the protection of the greater king. He enforces the treaty among the masses. So in this brief introduction, we see a lot of parallels immediately, which obviously are being referred to in the reproduction of this treaty between God and Israel as what was already being done at the same time again of the nations of the places. Moses, who was born and raised under Pharaoh in Egypt in those settings to become a political leader, he also would have been familiar with the status and usage of suzerain vassal treaties, again, which was common amongst the people of the times. And we can see here that he produces a very close, very intimate relationship by concerning God, the suzerain, as the father, and the vassal as the son. We see Adam being referred to as the son, Israel being referred to as the son, Ephraim being referred to as a son, Jesus being referred to as son. So the son is very interesting in that must mean, according to the times, there was a family issue also associated with it. We also see the point that he says the greater king is the suzerain and the lesser king is a prince. And that's what we find out about Jesus, the prince. The interesting, because prince is also the standing for the principal, the most important thing. So when we take a look at that, we do see those situations being placed over Moses, the one who's actually writing this, as the greater king is God the suzerain, and the lesser king or prince is Moses, who is working in service of God. But the lesser king, Moses, is also representative of all the common people who are under the protection of God, who also, Moses, enforces the treaty among all the peoples. So we can see not only is Moses familiar with this, but he establishes the working order amongst the tribes via himself. Meredith Kline continues on with these suzerain vassal treaties open with two sections. So we're going to get into the construction of how these vassal treaties are put together, which are very important to us because Moses, who's putting this together, does follow this structure. So we can see the first part, the identification of the suzerain by name and title. 2, the historical survey of the suzerain's dealings with the vassal. The purpose was to illustrate to the vassal how much the suzerain has done to protect and establish the vassal, who therefore owes submission and allegiance to the suzerain. These two sections are referred to as the preamble. We saw that even being replayed a little bit in Exodus when God said, "You yourselves have seen how I delivered you from the Egyptians and brought you to myself." Again, showing all the great things that he has done for the people. So now after the preamble, we get the next section of these treaties, which is called the stipulations. So the next section lists these stipulations, which the vassal is required to do, which is spelt out in principle and detail. This section is often concluded with the requirement that the vassal deposit his copy of the treaty in his temple, where he is to occasionally read and study it to refresh his memory concerning his duties. The last section of these treaties contains the blessings and curses of the suzerain. If the stipulations are met by the vassal, he will receive the suzerain's blessings, which are listed. If the vassal fails to meet with the stipulations, he will receive the suzerain's curses, which are also listed. So the suzerain contract treaty system starts out with the history leading up to the covenant being made for the people. Then the second section will include the stipulations, which are all the rules, the requirements associated between the two. And then the last section is going to concern things of whether or not did the vassal live up to those stipulations, and if they did, they would get a blessing, and if they failed, they would get a curse. So this structure of the suzerain vassal treaty we do see throughout the Torah, and the Torah itself is also structured as a suzerain treaty. As we see when we take a look at this, we see this commandment, and I want to point out in the middle section when Meredith Kline says this section is often concluded with the requirement that the vassal deposit his copy of the treaty in his temple, where he is to occasionally read and study it to refresh his memory concerning his duties. Well, that's interesting because when we read in Exodus, the Lord said to Moses, "Write these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel." And these are the statutes or the stipulations and the laws that the Lord made between himself and the people of Israel through Moses on Mount Sinai. So in Genesis, we're seeing the historical prologue. We're seeing what God did all the way from Adam all the way up to Israel in order to include Israel into this covenant. So Genesis is this history of God doing all these great things that made it so Israel would be included. Then we get to Exodus and we see Moses pulling Israel out of Egypt. And that's where now the Lord is telling him, "Write these words down, for I have made a covenant with you." And thus the suzerain treaty was put into action. And that's why we do see in Leviticus the stipulations. So Genesis, we had the preamble or the historical prologue. Exodus, we've got the covenant being made and written down. Leviticus, we get into the stipulations. So now we're no longer in the history, but now we're in the stipulations section, which the Lord made between him and himself through Moses on Mount Sinai. Then we read in Deuteronomy concerning the curses and the blessings, whether or not they live up to these agreements. We'll start in verse 9 where it says, Then Moses wrote this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord. At the end of every 7 years, when all Israel was to come to appear before the Lord your God, you shall read this law before all Israel and all their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, and little ones, and the sojourner within your towns, that they may hear and be careful to do all the words of this law. And so now what's interesting is that's what we heard was one of the requirements was to keep this law around, and so that they would pull it out and refresh their duties and be reminded of they need to do this. And that's exactly what we see being described here in Deuteronomy 31, and we'll continue verse 13, so that their children who have not known the words of this law may hear it, and as long as they do this in the land as they live in it. So throughout the generations to come, all the new children that come will be able to hear this every 7 years and learn what is required of them. It goes on to say that when Moses had finished writing the words of this law in a book to the very end, Moses commanded the Levites to take this book of the law and put it by the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord, that may be there as a witness against them. So when Moses had finished writing down all that he had written down, he took it and put it into the ark so that it would remain there. So we have, just as the suzerain vassal treaty commands in the culture, to take a copy of the law, of the stipulations and the agreements, the blessings and the curses, put it in to a safe place of keeping, and to pull it out for reading and remembrance. So we see them living up to these agreements. So we have Moses' Torah, which is divided now into two main distinct sections following the suzerain treaty structure. The historical prologue, which is Genesis, which is cataloging the series of events that led up to Israel being included into the covenant of God, while the stipulations and other treaty requirements of the suzerain vassal treaty are found in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which catalogs the creation of Israel as the new covenant people. And this is given to us in the narrative that is given by the story of Moses, which Moses claims that God created a people whom were chosen to rule over the land of Mesopotamia. That was Adam. Now that chosen people did not live up to their covenant agreement. Therefore, God destroyed them in accordance with that agreement. So the covenant right to rule then passed to the descendant Noah, which passed to Shem, which passed to Abraham, and finally it came to Israel. And Moses is claiming in this narrative that they were the next in line to inherit the kingdom covenant rule. There was one covenant with two covenant kingdoms. The first one was Adam in Eden, and he passed that covenant and its rights to Israel. And that's what Moses is claiming is the context of the Torah. And now we're going to take a look to see how Moses went about describing these terms so that we can understand what the Torah is talking about, identifying and stressing so that we can understand what is the context behind the Torah and these two kingdoms. So let's get into the second part of our discussion, the Torah and its two kingdoms. So we're going to begin the second part of the discussion by going into Genesis, the historical prologue, which was authored by Moses. This is the describing the creation of the first covenant kingdom of Adam in Eden, while Moses is claiming Israel inherited the God-given right to rule the land from these people. So this is the first people being described as making covenant with God. And it's done so in the language of out of the ground the Lord God caused to grow every tree. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was in the midst of the garden. Now we also know that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, there was a command that said, you shall not eat of it, for in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. So what we end up getting, because there's no restrictions to either one of these, we get the tree of life was in the midst of the garden. And what was the garden described as? Well, it says, out of the ground the Lord God caused to grow every tree that is pleasing to the sight and good for food. The tree was in there, and the tree of life was in there, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So they had equal access to the tree of life and to the tree of death. And we're going to refer to it simply as the tree of death because in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. So the results of eating from the tree of life becomes obviously is that the association is life, and eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is associated to the tree of death. And that then puts us into an interesting position because Moses is describing Adam was given the choice between the tree of life and the tree of death. Well, describing the creation of the second covenant kingdom, Israel, by the same author Moses, Moses goes out of his way to duplicate the creation language of Adam and Israel. As we see in Deuteronomy 30, verse 15, it says, see, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments, then you shall live. But if your heart turns away, you shall surely perish. That's interesting because he says, I have set before you life and death, good and evil. Well, that's what we find here. Out of the ground God caused to grow out of the tree the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. So that's very interesting. We have the life and good, death and evil. And we also have, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, saying that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you may live. So now Moses is describing Israel with the same covenant agreement. Choose life or death. What's also interesting is we get that secondary word curse now, that I may set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Life and blessing are juxtaposed, being together against death and curse. So God has set before you the life and blessing, death and the curse. So depending on your choice, you get your repercussions. When we read in Deuteronomy, Israel, the second kingdom, transgressing the law results in a curse. As we just read in Deuteronomy 28, we get that direct command. If you do not obey the Lord your God to do all his commandments and statutes, then all these curses will come upon you. Interestingly, the curses are a womb issue and a ground issue. Deuteronomy 28 says, cursed shall be the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your ground. So Israel, who just made a covenant agreement with God after coming out of Egypt, agreed that if they transgress the agreement of God, the oath of the Moses agreement, that their fruit of their womb will be cursed, that the fruit of their ground would be cursed if they don't live up to their agreement. That's pretty interesting because Eden, the first kingdom, after they were transgressing the tree of death, it also results in a ground curse, as we read, because you have listened to the voice of your wife. That's interesting because that breaks the covenant oath, which was to obey the voice of God. Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree which I commanded you, saying you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground because of you. Well, that's the same charge that we see of Daniel saying all of Israel has transgressed because they refused to obey the word of the Lord. Well, here we have them refusing to obey the word of the Lord, and they're obeying the word of the wife. And as a result, cursed is the ground because of you. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow. Which, when we read Deuteronomy, cursed shall be the fruit of your ground. Adam was cursed. The curse is on the ground, and what happened? It now will only produce thorns and thistles. It will now have no fruit. This is also duplicated further when Eden, the first kingdom, which was involved in that, now also has a fruit of the womb issue as well. For to the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing, and in pain you shall bring forth children. So we have both, as we see, if you break the commandment, you will be cursed. Well, we see the curse with Israel would be the fruit of the womb and the fruit of the ground. And we see that God said to Adam, if you break this, then you will be killed. You will come into death. And what happened? He broke it. He ate from it. And that death was also a curse. And what was the curse? The same fruit of the ground and fruit of the womb issue. So Moses is actually presenting two peoples, Adam and Israel, as both being under the same covenant agreement, with Israel as Adam's descendants. Adam in Eden was given the choice of the tree of life and death with a curse for disobedience. Israel in Jerusalem was given a choice of life and death with a curse for disobedience. Following the Torah, both of these people's story mirror each other as both become transgressors of the agreement and both become cursed. Both also then find themselves in need of rest from their sins. So as we finish up with this interesting story of the Torah and its two kingdoms, and we see not only have they made agreements, both of these people that are described in the Torah, both become transgressors of these, and now both are looking for rest, and both have judgment coming. So here we have, moving forward, what comes after the curse. Well, we see in the Hebrew name Noah a very interesting understanding. We're pretty familiar with, in Hebrew, names actually have meanings behind it, as opposed to just more like some North American. There's typically nothing behind a name. It's just a name. It's a declaration of who a person is. But in Hebrew, the names often have a name associated with the event surrounding their birth, or some kind of characteristic comparative to God in some way. When we get to the birth of Noah, we get an interesting name usage here concerning the event of Noah's time, which was, in Hebrew, the name Noah, which comes from the word to mean rest. That's very interesting because when we read in Eden, so now after Adam and Eve had fallen, they'd become cursed, and they were now in the death. They had gone from life and blessing, eating of the fruits of the land, and had become cursed and returned to dust, where they had fruitlessness and the curse of the womb. And we read in Genesis 5, Lamech lived 182 years and became the father of a son. Now he called his name Noah. He called his son Rest, saying, this one, Noah, will give us rest from our work and from the toil of our hands, arising from the ground which the Lord has cursed. So here we have the story of Adam and Eve, curse of the womb, curse of the fruit of the land. Then we have Noah coming to bring rest, and it says, I'm going to name my son Rest, because this one, Noah, will bring us rest from the toil of the curse. This is very important. He named his son Rest because his son would bring the rest to the curse of Adam's disobedience. The word we can see here in Genesis 5:29, and to save them from the toil. When we take a look at the word toil, it's the Hebrew word itzabon. It's translated into the word pain and toil. Itzabon. Well, the only other two places it is translated that way is Genesis 3:16, which is the curse of the womb and the curse of the land. And that's what the rest came to get rid of, that toil. So this one will give us rest from the curse of the womb and the curse of the fruitless land, which the Lord has cursed. Noah brought the rest to the curse of Eden. Now, in the second kingdom, interestingly enough, we get the same situation happening. The word came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, "Hear the words of this covenant. Speak to the men of Judah and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem." So this obviously is referring to the covenant of Moses that was made thousands of years after Adam. So Adam went through his covenant. He agreed to those conditions. He did not live up to those conditions, and he failed. So God judged that failure and removed the kingdom from him and destroyed him. And for a time period, the promise of this kingdom's rule passed through generations until it came to Israel, who then engaged as the descendant, the next to inherit that kingdom and the right to rule in the land. And they engaged in the covenant, and they began to walk in those things. However, now we can see, according to this, they broke that covenant, saying, "Hear the words of this covenant, and speak to the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, saying, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Cursed is the man who does not heed the words of this covenant." So write to those suzerain vassal stipulations. He will be cursed if he does not walk in the stipulations of the agreement of Exodus, which I commanded your forefathers in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt from the iron furnace, saying, "Listen to my voice, do according to all that I command. You shall be my people, and I will be your God, in order to confirm the oath which I swore to your forefathers to give them a land, as it is to this day." So here's God now saying to the current people of Jeremiah, the descendants of those that came out of Egypt, saying, they did not live up to my words, and now you also are no longer living up to my words. So therefore Jeremiah was told, "Proclaim all these words in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem, saying, Hear the words of this covenant and do them. I solemnly warned your fathers in the day that I brought them up from the land of Egypt, even to this day warning persistently, saying, Listen to my voice." Again, a reference to the Exodus agreement. If you indeed will obey my voice and keep my covenant, if you follow the stipulations, be obedient and be faithful to live up to those agreements, and they will not. Even after all of God's reminders, Jeremiah continues saying, "They did not obey or incline their ear. Therefore I brought on them all the words of this covenant which I commanded them to do, but they did not." A conspiracy has been found among the men of Judah, among all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. They have turned back to the iniquities of their ancestors who refused to hear my words. The house of Israel and the house of Judah have broken my covenant which I made with their fathers. So not only did the fathers break the covenant, now also the fathers' descendants are breaking the covenant yet again, following in their ancestors' footsteps, just as they followed in the footsteps of their ancestors Adam and Eden. And now we see what Daniel was talking about when he said, "All of Israel has transgressed your law." That's not Adam. That's not referring to Adam's law. That's referring to Israel's agreement. Adam had his own agreement in Eden. Israel has their own agreement in Jerusalem. And all of Israel has transgressed the law, turning aside, refusing to obey the voice of the agreement. And that curse, because when they swore the oath, that curse which was written in that oath has been poured out upon them because they did not keep their words. They had sinned. And now that they were in that position, the Messiah had come to them to save them, to remove them out of the curse. But not all of them were included in that salvation. And in Hebrews it outlines this, saying, "Therefore, just as the Holy Spirit said, Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me, as in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tried me by testing me, and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was angry with this generation, and said, They always go astray in their heart, and they did not know my ways. So as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Well, wait a minute. That rest, they were, when we look back, that's Noah. Noah came to bring rest to those who were suffering under the curse. And now Hebrews is bringing up the fact that they did not enter the rest and starts stressing, well, who were those? Well, those who heard and yet rebelled, was it not all those who left Egypt led by Moses? So there's the Adam rebellion, and now there's the Israel rebellion. And now we're seeing the end of this period as they're writing at the times of the arrival of the Messiah, and he says they did not live up with it. And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest? But those who were disobedient. And that's the claim. All has transgressed, refusing to obey your voice. And that's what this is addressing. And to whom did he swear would not enter his rest? The disobedient. So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. Well, then he goes on to say, well, good news came to them just as it was coming to the people of the time of the Messiah. The Hebrews author was saying their people were now receiving good news. The message that the previous people that had heard the good news did not benefit them because the previous people did not unite it with faith. But in verse 3 it says, for we who have believed have entered that rest. As he had sworn, I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter. So those who did not believe did not enter. But in verse 4:10 he goes on to say, for whoever has entered God's rest has also entered rest from his works as God did from his. So the Hebrews under the law were given works of the land, the curse, and they become cursed by not living up to those works, and now were burdened, and they were in toil, just as the same times like Noah. So God sent Jesus, who said, come to me, all who labor and are of heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Rest from the work and the toil brought on by the curse, just as Noah, the man of rest. Here comes Jesus, the Messiah, bringing rest, God's rest, to the curse in which he cursed them, just as was with Adam in Eden. Adam broke the agreement. God cursed them according to that agreement. God sent them a Savior from that cursing. Israel entered agreement with God. They did not live up to that agreement, so they were cursed according to that agreement, and God sent Jesus to bring them rest from that curse. Just as it says in Galatians 3:13, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. Israel was redeemed from the curse of the Mosaic covenant that they did not live up to. There will no longer be any curse, and the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his bondservants will serve him. And both Noah and Jesus brought rest from the curse, just as it says in Matthew 24, from the mouth of Jesus. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man, the rest. So we have one covenant with two kingdoms. God formed the first ruling kingdom over the land of Mesopotamia and placed it in Adam. That empire under man broke their agreement with God and fell into death and curse, until Noah released them from their curse. God then chose Israel, Adam's descendant, who through Moses entered into their agreement with God. However, Israel broke their agreement like Adam and were also cursed, until Jesus released them from their curse. Adam had his own kingdom start to finish, and Israel had their own kingdom start to finish. Both kingdoms were under the same agreement with God to be the ruling head over the land. There was one family agreement, only one covenant. There were two kingdom participants, Adam in Eden Israel and Jerusalem. It started with Adam and Eden and ended in transgression, judgment, with a water flood, curse removed by Noah. It started with Moses in Jerusalem and ended in transgression, judgment, with a flood of fire, and a curse removed by Jesus, the last Adam. From first Adam to last Adam, one covenant from start to finish. The Torah and the two kingdoms, what began in Eden, completed in Israel. If you enjoy the work that I do on this channel, would like to support me, feel free by doing so by the email provided on the screen and the information. And I'd just like to say thank you for coming along with me on this adventure. If you have questions or concerns about what I'm teaching and would like to comment on it, please feel free to in the comments section. Or if not, and want to actually further this conversation maybe more in depth and pursue it maybe more in a long discussion format, I'm available on Discord. I have a link on the very first video, I think it is, on this channel. And if you go back and look at it, the link should be open there, and you can come on over and we can have some good conversations, discussions concerning these things, as what could be more important than better understanding of the Bible. So I appreciate your time, and wherever you are, I hope this finds you well. God bless.